gonna do something about it? He reached for her. He never got the chance to find out what came next. Her hand caught his wrist before his fingers even touched her. One turn, his own weight against him, and the captain of the football team went down onto one knee in front of 200 people in under 2 seconds, without her ever raising her voice. The whole party went silent. 6 days earlier, this same boy had yanked her ponytail in a parking lot and laughed. He thought she was small, quiet, an easy target. He never asked who her grandfather was. He never asked what 6 years of quiet backyard mornings had built inside her. Now he was about to lie about all of it and use his father's power to bury the truth. But some things won't stay buried. Stay with me. You'll want to see how this ends. Every small town has a house like the Calloway house. White paint gone soft with age. A porch swing that creaks in the right kind of way. A grandfather who still gets up before sunrise, out of habit, not necessity. That's where Josephine Calloway grew up. Everybody called her Jo. She was 18 years old the week this story starts. Quiet, small for her age. The kind of girl who says thank you to bus drivers and means it. Nobody looking at her would guess what she carried underneath. Not muscle, not size, discipline. Her grandfather Walter had trained police officers for almost 3 decades, not soldiers, not fighters looking for glory, officers who needed to know how to protect someone without losing themselves in the process. He trained his granddaughter the same way. It started when Jo was 12. She came home from school one afternoon with a bruise on her arm from a boy in her class who thought shoving smaller kids around the playground was funny. She never told her grandfather what happened. She didn't have to. Walter noticed the way she flinched when someone raised their voice at dinner that night, and the next morning, before the sun was even fully up, he was standing in the backyard with 2 cups of coffee, one for him, one poured out just for show. And he asked her a simple question. "You want to learn how to never feel that small again?" She said yes before he even finished the sentence. They trained 3 mornings a week after that, sometimes more if she asked. Walter never pushed her past what she could handle. He never yelled, never used the kind of drill sergeant tone you see in movies. He taught the way a good teacher always does. Patient, willing to repeat the same movement 50 times, if that's what it took, correcting her elbow. Her stance, her breathing, until the motion stopped feeling like something she was doing and started feeling like something she simply knew. Some mornings it rained, and they trained anyway, moving into the garage mats laid out over the cold concrete floor. Some mornings her grandmother Ruth watched from the kitchen window with a cup of tea, smiling at the 2 of them out there in the early light, never once telling Walter he was pushing the girl too hard, because she could see plain as day that he wasn't. 6 years of it. Quiet mornings, no trophies, no belts hanging on a wall. Just one rule repeated so many times, it became part of her breathing. You do not use this to start something. You use it to end something. Jo carried that rule with her the day she packed her bags for Ashcombe State University. She carried something else too, a hair tie, faded blue, frayed at the edges, the kind you'd throw away if it belonged to anybody else. It belonged to her grandmother. Ruth Calloway passed 2 winters back. Before she went from a hospital bed, her voice thin but steady, she pressed that small piece of elastic into Jo's palm and said something Jo never forgot. Hold on to this, not because it's special, because you'll remember who gave it to you. Jo had cried that day. Ruth hadn't. She'd just squeezed her granddaughter's hand and added one more thing, the kind of thing that settles into a person and never quite leaves. The people who love you don't leave when they're gone, honey. They just change shape. They turn into little things, a recipe, a song on the radio, a hair tie in a drawer. Jo wore it around her wrist like a bracelet most days. Some mornings, she moved it up into her ponytail instead. She had no idea that small piece of fabric would end up at the center of everything. Not yet. Let's go back to the beginning. Move-in day. The parking lot outside Kessler Hall was loud that morning. Car doors slamming. Parents hauling mini fridges up 3 flights of stairs. Freshmen trying to look like they weren't scared out of their minds. Jo stood near her car waiting for her ride to finish unloading the last box. That's when she saw him, for the first time. Brayden Kessler, 20 years old, broad shoulders. The kind of walk that says the whole campus belongs to him. He probably believed it did. His father was Gordon Kessler, a city council member with his name on half the buildings downtown. Brayden had grown up hearing people say yes to him before he even finished asking. He was the starting captain of the football team. Juniors, seniors, didn't matter. Everybody deferred to him. That kind of power does something to a young man if nobody ever tells him no. Brayden and 3 of his teammates came walking through the lot that morning laughing about something none of them would remember by lunch. Jo didn't notice them at first. She was busy adjusting the ponytail her grandmother's hair tie was holding in place. Brayden noticed her. Small, quiet, new, an easy target, or so he thought. He walked past her slow enough to make it obvious and reached out and yanked her ponytail hard enough to snap the tie clean in half. It happened fast. A flick of the wrist, a joke to him. Jo's hair fell loose around her shoulders. The blue hair tie dropped to the pavement, broken into 2 pieces. Brayden laughed. So did his friends. "New girl already losing her hair," one of them said. A few students nearby laughed too, the nervous kind of laugh people do when they don't know what else to do. Jo didn't cry. She didn't yell. She knelt down right there in the parking lot and picked up both halves of that broken hair tie like they were made of glass. Somebody watching might have thought she was embarrassed. Somebody watching closely would have seen something else. She was memorizing his face. Brayden waited a second, expecting a reaction. Tears, anger, something to feed off. He got silence. That silence bothered him more than he let on. You could see it if you were paying attention. A flicker in his eyes. Confusion, maybe. Or something close to it. He shrugged it off, called her a name under his breath, and walked away laughing with his buddies like nothing happened. For him, nothing had. For Jo, everything had started. There was one man in that parking lot who was paying attention. Ed Whitfield, 61 years old, campus security, 22 years on the local police force before that back trouble forcing him into early retirement. Ed had spent his whole career learning how to read people. Not what they say, how they stand, how they move, where their weight sits when they think nobody's watching. 22 years on the force had taught him that lesson the hard way more than once. He'd learned it responding to calls where the loudest person in the room usually wasn't the dangerous one. He'd learned it working traffic stops, where a driver's hands told him more than anything they said. His wife Linda used to tease him that he couldn't sit through a movie without narrating what every character's body language really meant, and most of the time, he was right. Linda had passed 3 years back quietly in her sleep, the kind of ending that offered no warning, and left Ed with more silence in his evenings than he knew what to do with. Taking the campus security job had helped in its own small way. It gave his mornings a shape again. Gave him a reason to keep noticing things the way he'd always noticed things, even without anybody at home to tell about it over dinner. Retirement hadn't been his choice, not entirely. A herniated disc from a foot pursuit in his final year on the job had ended things faster than he wanted. Campus security wasn't exactly the work he'd imagined doing at 61, walking a quiet college quad instead of patrolling real streets. But he told himself the same thing most mornings when he clocked in. These are somebody's kids. They deserve somebody paying attention. He'd been leaning against the building that morning, coffee in hand, watching the chaos of move-in day. The way he watched everything now, quietly, carefully. He saw the hair pull, he saw the laugh, he saw Jo kneel down. But it was the way she knelt that caught him. Balanced, controlled, weight low and centered like she could come up swinging if she needed to, but chose not to. That's not how a scared 18-year-old kneels down. Ed had seen that kind of balance exactly one other time in his life. 23 years ago, in a training gym 2 towns over, watching a man named Walter Calloway teach young officers how to fall without getting hurt. Ed didn't say anything that day. He just filed it away. Some things you don't forget, even after 2 decades. He watched Jo tuck both broken pieces of that hair tie into her jacket pocket and walk toward the dorms without looking back at Brayden even once. That not looking back stuck with Ed longer than anything else. Most people who get humiliated in public can't help but glance around. See who's watching. See who's judging. Jo didn't need to look. She already knew exactly who she was. The girl assigned to Jo's dorm room was named Chloe Bennett. Chloe was from 3 hours north, a nervous kind of friendly, always apologizing for things that weren't her fault. When Jo walked in that afternoon, hair down, no explanation offered, Chloe noticed right away that something had happened. "You okay?" Chloe asked. Jo nodded and started unpacking her books. Chloe didn't push. She'd find out soon enough the way everybody on that floor found out things. Through whispers in the hallway, through half-true stories, passed from room to room like a bad cold. By dinner time, half the freshman dorm had heard some version of what happened in the parking lot. Most of the versions made Brayden sound like he was just having fun. That's how it usually goes when the person with power tells the story first. Jo didn't correct anybody. She sat at the far end of the dining hall with a tray of food she barely touched, and she thought about her grandfather. She could hear his voice in her head, steady as ever. Anger is loud. Discipline is quiet. Loud never wins in the long run. That night she called him. It rang twice before he picked up. "Hey kiddo," he said, "how's the big city treating you?" Ashcombe State was hardly a big city. It was the kind of small college town where the local diner knew your order by the second week. But Walter liked to tease her about it anyway. "It's fine," Jo said. Walter had trained enough young people to hear the gap between fine and fine. "You don't sound fine," he said. Jo told him. Not with anger, just facts. The parking lot, the hair tie, the laughing. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You didn't do anything," he finally said. It wasn't a question. "I remembered what you taught me," Jo said. "This isn't the moment. Not yet." Walter let out a breath, something between a sigh and a proud kind of exhale. "Your grandmother would be proud of you right now," he said, "and so am I." Jo held the phone a little tighter. "I kept the pieces," she said quietly. "Of the hair tie. I don't know why. Because some things aren't just things," Walter said. "You'll know what to do with it when the time comes." They talked another few minutes about nothing in particular. Classes, the dorm, whether the dining hall food was as bad as everyone online said it was. Before they hung up, Walter said one more thing, the same thing he'd told her 100 times growing up. "You don't fight to prove you're strong, kiddo. You fight to protect what matters. Everything else you let go." Jo said goodnight and set the phone down. She looked at the 2 broken pieces of blue elastic sitting on her desk. She didn't throw them away. Monday morning, Jo walked into her first class, an introductory psychology lecture, in a hall that seated close to 200 students. She found a seat near the middle, opened her notebook, and tried to focus on the professor's opening remarks about the syllabus. She felt eyes on her before she saw them. Brayden sat 4 rows back with 2 of his teammates close enough that his voice carried without him even trying very hard. "That's the one from the parking lot," he said. Not quite a whisper. Girl who didn't even flinch. Kind of weird, honestly. His friends laughed low enough not to disturb the professor, loud enough for Jo to hear every word. Jo kept her eyes on her notebook. She wrote down the professor's first 3 bullet points and didn't look back once. It would have been easy to feel small in that moment. 200 strangers in a lecture hall, and somewhere behind her, 3 young men treating her humiliation like entertainment. She thought about her grandfather instead. About the backyard. About balance. You don't lose your footing just because somebody's trying to knock you off it. Outside the lecture hall, the September air was still warm. Students moving in every direction across the quad, none of them aware of the small, quiet battle that had just played out in row 12 of a 200-seat classroom. Jo walked toward her next class, and for a moment she let herself feel the sting of it. Not anger exactly. Something closer to tiredness. She was 18 years old, 3 days into her first semester of college, and she was already spending more energy managing another person's cruelty than she was spending on her actual classes. That thought bothered her more than the comments themselves had. She reminded herself of something her grandfather used to say when she got frustrated during training, back when a technique wasn't clicking the way she wanted it to. Frustration means you're paying attention. Just don't let it make the decisions for you. She took a breath, adjusted the strap of her backpack, and kept walking. The next few days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Brayden didn't let it go. Some bullies get their laugh and move on. Brayden wasn't built that way. Joe's silence in that parking lot had gotten under his skin more than he wanted to admit. And the only way he knew how to deal with that feeling was to push harder. Tuesday, he knocked her books off her desk in the campus library, loud enough for half the room to notice, and mumbled an insincere sorry that fooled nobody. Wednesday, one of his friends spilled a drink across her table in the dining hall, and Brayden stood a few feet away, laughing like it was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. Thursday, he blocked the stairwell she needed to get to class. Arms crossed, smirking, making her either squeeze past him or walk the long way around. She walked the long way around, not because she was afraid, because she was watching. Every single time Joe said almost nothing. A short sentence here and there delivered flat and calm, never raising her voice. Standing in that stairwell. Thursday afternoon, with Brayden blocking her path and two of his friends filming on their phones for laughs, Joe finally said something that made him pause. "You've still got time to step back," she told him. It wasn't a threat. It didn't sound like one. It sounded almost like an offer. Brayden laughed it off in front of his friends, the way he laughed off everything that confused him. Step back from what he said. "You gonna do something about it?" Joe didn't answer. She just looked at him steady until he got bored of waiting for a reaction and moved aside. His friends thought it was hilarious. "New girl thinks she's tough," one of them said, as they walked off, still laughing. But not everybody in that stairwell was laughing. A junior named Hannah, who lived 2 floors up, had watched the whole thing from the top of the steps. She didn't know Joe. She'd never spoken a word to her. But something about the way Joe held her ground, calm and unshaken, while 3 young men mocked her, stuck with Hannah the rest of the day. Hannah had her own reasons for paying attention to boys like Brayden. 2 years earlier, during her own freshman year, she'd watched a friend get quietly pushed out of the dorms after a similar situation with a different group of athletes. Nothing official ever happened. No hearing, no consequences. Her friend just transferred to a community college back home the following spring, and everybody moved on like it never occurred. It still bothered Hannah the way some things do even years later. The unfairness of it. The way power always seemed to protect itself on this campus, no matter how many people got hurt along the way. She made a mental note of Joe's name that day in the stairwell. Josephine Calloway. She didn't know why exactly, only that something told her it might matter later. She didn't say anything to anyone about it. Not yet. But she remembered. That's how these things start to turn. Quietly. One person at a time noticing something isn't right, even if they don't say it out loud yet. Down in the administration building, a man named Dean Foster was reviewing new student paperwork that same Thursday afternoon, unaware his desk would soon be at the center of everything unfolding on his campus. Foster had been dean of students for 6 years, a fair-minded man by most accounts, but one who'd learned through experience that certain families carried more weight in these hallways than others. Brayden Kessler sat on the city council. Brayden Kessler had personally funded the new weight room in the athletics complex 2 years back. When Brayden Kessler's son got mentioned in a complaint, Foster had learned to tread carefully, gathering every fact twice before making a single move. Foster had gotten into higher education administration almost 20 years earlier, back when he still believed in the simple way young graduates often do. That fairness was mostly a matter of following the rules closely enough. 2 decades of budget meetings and donor dinners had complicated that belief considerably, without ever quite destroying it. He still believed in fairness. He just understood now how much quiet pressure worked against it every single day, in ways most students never saw and most donors never had to acknowledge. He had no complaint on his desk yet regarding Brayden Kessler and the new freshman named Calloway. That would change soon enough. Ed Whitfield noticed something too, though, from a different angle. Part of his job was reviewing the campus security footage each week, mostly boring stuff. Skateboarders where they shouldn't be. Somebody propping a fire door open to sneak friends in. But he found himself rewinding the stairwell footage from Thursday more than once. He watched Brayden block her path. He watched the two friends filming. He watched Jo stand there, weight-balanced, hands relaxed at her sides. Not one flinch of fear on her face. He paused the footage right as Jo said something to Brayden. No audio on that camera, so Ed couldn't hear the words. But he read her lips well enough. Decades of watching interrogation footage had trained his eye for that. "You've still got time to step back." Ed leaned back in his chair, coffee gone cold beside him, and thought about Walter Calloway's training gym again. He decided it was time to ask around. That Friday, Ed found himself at the campus recreation center, where he knew Coach Renee Coulter ran the self-defense elective for students who wanted an easy elective credit and a decent workout. Renee had been coaching at Ashcombe State for almost 15 years. She'd competed in judo back in her 20s, good enough to nearly make it to nationals before a knee injury ended that dream. These days, she taught freshmen how to break a wrist grab and fall without breaking their tailbone. Ed found her wiping down mats after her Friday class. "Got a minute?" he asked. Renee wiped sweat off her forehead and nodded. "For you, Ed, always." He told her what he'd seen, the parking lot, the stairwell, the way Jo carried herself. Renee listened without interrupting, the way good coaches learn to do. "You said the last name's Calloway?" she asked when he finished. "Josephine Calloway," Ed confirmed. "Freshman." Renee's face changed slightly. "There aren't a lot of Calloways in self-defense circles around here," she said. "Not since Walter retired?" "You knew him?" Ed asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Everybody in this region who taught defensive tactics knew Walter Calloway," Renee said. "Man trained half the police academies within 100 miles. Best hands I ever saw on a 60-year-old. Renee thought back to a seminar she'd attended years ago, one of the last ones Walter Calloway ever taught before he stepped away from that world entirely. She remembered him standing in front of a room full of police recruits, half of them twice his size, demonstrating a wrist lock with a gentleness that made the whole room go quiet. He'd said something that day she never forgot. The goal was never to hurt anybody. The goal was to make sure nobody had the chance to hurt you, and to walk away with your hands clean and your conscience clear. That kind of philosophy didn't come from a man chasing violence. It came from a man who respected exactly how much damage a trained body could do and who refused to treat that power carelessly. If Walter Calloway's granddaughter had learned even half of what he taught Renee, then whoever kept pushing her was standing far closer to the edge of a cliff than they realized. "You think this freshman is his granddaughter?" Renee asked. "I think it's worth finding out," Ed said. Renee looked out the window of the rec center toward the dorms in the distance. "If she's anything like her grandfather," Renee said slowly, "I feel bad for whoever thinks they can push her around." Ed almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Me too. But I also worry about what happens if it goes too far before anybody steps in." Renee nodded slowly, thinking it over. "You think we should say something to her?" Renee asked. "Let her know people are watching out for her." Ed considered that for a moment. "Not yet," he said. "She hasn't asked for help, and there's something about the way she carries herself that tells me she wouldn't want us stepping in before she's ready. But if things escalate, I want us both paying close enough attention that we're not caught flat-footed." Renee glanced toward the window one more time before turning back to him. "There's a difference, isn't there, between watching out for somebody and hovering over them? Jo strikes me as the kind of person who'd notice the difference right away and wouldn't thank us much for getting it wrong." Ed nodded. "That's exactly it. We stay close enough to help if it's needed. Far enough that she gets to handle her own life the way she's clearly capable of handling it." That worry sat with both of them the rest of the day. Neither one said anything to Jo directly. Not yet. It wasn't their place to pry into a stranger's family history based on a hunch. But they both started paying closer attention. Back in the dorm, Chloe was starting to piece together her own picture of what was happening, mostly through the gossip mill that ran non-stop on their floor. Chloe had her own history with situations like this, though she'd never told anyone at Ashcombe State about it. Back in high school, she'd watched a boy get bullied so badly by the football team that he stopped coming to school entirely by junior year. Chloe hadn't done anything back then. She'd been 16, scared, worried about her own social standing, and she'd told herself it wasn't her problem to fix. She still thought about that boy sometimes, wondered where he ended up, wondered if things might have gone differently if just one more person had spoken up when it mattered. That memory sat with her Friday evening, while she caught Joe alone doing laundry in the basement, the low hum of dryers filling the silence between them. "People are talking about you," Chloe said carefully. Joe kept folding a shirt, not looking up. "I figured. They're saying Brayden's messing with you," Chloe continued. "Some people think it's funny. Some people think you did something to deserve it." Joe's hands paused for just a second. "I didn't do anything," she said quietly. "I believe you," Chloe said quickly. I don't know. I've seen him do this before. To other people. Freshman year stuff. He gets bored and picks somebody, and it just gets worse from there." "What happens to them?" Joe asked. "The other people." Chloe hesitated. "Some transferred out. One girl switched dorms halfway through the semester just to get away from his friend group. Nobody ever pushed back." Chloe shook her head. "His dad's on the city council. Big donor to the athletics program. Teachers don't want the headache. Administration looks the other way. It's just easier for everybody to let it go." Joe finally looked up from the laundry. "That's not the same as it being okay," she said. Chloe didn't have an answer for that. "I'm not trying to scare you," she added after a moment. "I just don't want you to get hurt trying to stand up to him. He's got a lot of people behind him." Joe folded the last shirt and set it neatly in her basket. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "But I'm not planning on starting anything." Chloe studied her for a second, something unreadable behind her eyes. "That's not really what I'm worried about," Chloe said quietly. Neither one of them said anything else that night. But something had shifted between them. Not quite friendship yet. Something closer to two people quietly deciding to trust each other, one small conversation at a time. Saturday brought Joe's first self-defense elective class, a general fitness requirement. Most freshmen fulfilled without much thought. Coach Renee Coulter ran the session in the small gym behind the rec center. 20-some freshmen scattered across blue mats, most of them checking their phones between drills. She started the way she always started a new semester, with a short talk about what the class actually was, and just as importantly, what it wasn't. "This isn't about becoming fighters," she told them, pacing slowly in front of the group. "Most of you will never need to use anything I teach in here. I hope you never do. But if the day ever comes when you need 30 seconds to get away from somebody bigger and stronger than you, I want your body to already know what to do, so your mind doesn't have to figure it out under pressure." A few students nodded along. Most were still half distracted thinking about lunch or the assignment due Monday. Joe sat near the back of the group, listening carefully the way she listened to everything. Renee's words weren't new to her. Her grandfather had said some version of the same thing 100 times over the years. But there was something comforting about hearing it from someone else, a reminder that what Walter taught her wasn't some strange family secret. It was wisdom real, and shared, passed down by people who understood exactly how fragile safety could be, and how much it was worth protecting. She had them practicing a basic wrist release drill, the kind of thing meant to build confidence more than actual skill. Renee paired students up randomly, calling out names from her clipboard. Calloway with Marcus, she called. Joe stepped onto the mat across from a tall, easygoing freshman, who grinned at her like this was the most fun he'd had all week. "Don't hurt me," he joked, grabbing her wrist the way Renee had just demonstrated. Joe executed the release exactly the way she'd been taught since she was 12 years old. Smooth, efficient, no wasted motion. Marcus stumbled back a step, more surprised than hurt, laughing it off. "Whoa. Okay," he said, rubbing his wrist. "Where'd you learn that?" Joe shrugged. "Just picked it up somewhere." Renee, standing a few mats away, had watched the whole exchange out of the corner of her eye. She'd taught that same drill hundreds of times. Most freshmen fumbled through it, awkward and hesitant, needing 3 or 4 attempts before it looked halfway right. Joe had done it once perfectly, without even seeming to think about it. Renee didn't say anything in front of the class. She just made a small note on her clipboard and kept teaching. After class ended and students filed out toward the locker rooms, Renee called Joe over. "Got a second?" she asked. Joe nodded, hanging back while the rest of the class cleared out. "That release you did," Renee said. "Where'd you really learn it?" Joe hesitated for the first time all week. "My grandfather taught me some things growing up." "What kind of things?" Renee asked, though her tone made it clear she already suspected. "Self-defense stuff," Joe said carefully. "Basic stuff." Renee studied her for a moment. "That wasn't basic," she said. "That was clean. Trained." "What's your grandfather's name?" Joe felt something cautious rise in her chest, an old instinct her grandfather had drilled into her. "Don't advertise what you know. Let people underestimate you. That's often your best advantage." "Walter Calloway," she finally said. Renee's face broke into something between a smile and disbelief. "I knew it," she said. "Ed thought it might be you." Joe blinked. "Ed's security guard. Older gentleman. He noticed something about you in the parking lot the first day. Recognized the training and the way you carried yourself." Joe didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent her whole life trying not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Joe said quietly. "I know," Renee said, her voice softening. "Nobody's accusing you of anything. I just want you to know, if things get complicated around here, there are people paying attention. People who understand what your training actually means." Joe nodded slowly, unsure how much comfort to take from that. It felt good in a way, also unfamiliar. She'd spent 6 years training in a quiet backyard with nobody watching but her grandfather. Now apparently people were watching. That evening, back in her dorm room, Joe sat by the window and looked out at the campus lights coming on, one by one, as the sun went down. Chloe was out with friends. The room was quiet. Joe picked up her phone and called her grandfather again, even though they'd already talked twice that week. Walter answered on the second ring, same as always. "Twice in 1 week," he said. "Something wrong?" "Not wrong," Joe said. "Just strange. There's a coach here who knew you, and a security guard who apparently recognized how I stand." Walter chuckled on the other end. "Small world." "It doesn't feel small," Joe said. "It feels like people are watching me for reasons I don't fully understand yet." There was a pause before Walter spoke again, his voice a little more serious now. "People will always underestimate you until the moment they can't anymore," he said. "That's not a bad thing, kiddo. That's an advantage. Just don't let it make you careless. And don't let it make you proud." "I won't," Joe said. "One more thing," Walter added. "Whatever's building up over there with this boy who's been bothering you, it's not going to just go away on its own. Bullies like that don't stop because somebody stayed quiet. They stop when somebody makes them stop the right way at the right time." "How do I know when it's the right time?" Joe asked. "You'll know," Walter said simply. "Your gut will tell you before your head does. Trust it." They talked a little longer about nothing important, the way family calls often drift towards small comforts when the big stuff feels too heavy to hold on to for too long. After they hung up, Joe sat with the 2 broken pieces of the blue hair tie resting in her palm. She thought about her grandmother, about the porch swing back home, about the quiet mornings training in the backyard while the sun came up over the fence line. She thought about Brayden's laugh in that parking lot. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. She was patient. Patience, her grandfather always said, is not the absence of strength. It's strength waiting for the right moment. The weekend brought Ashcombe State's traditional welcome bash, a campus-wide party held every year on the quad to kick off the semester. Every year, the university strung a few thousand paper lanterns and string lights across the old oak trees, hired a local band, and turned the first Saturday of the semester into something close to a town festival. Families from around Ashcombe often wandered through, too. drawn by the free food trucks and the music drifting across the green. It was supposed to be a night for new beginnings, for freshmen to shake off the nerves of their first week and feel, if only for a few hours, like they belonged somewhere. Brayden had been talking about it all week, loud enough for half the dorm to hear. "That new girl thinks she's tough," he told his teammates over lunch one afternoon, grinning like it was a joke he couldn't wait to tell. "Saturday we're going to have a little fun with her. Teach her how things work around here." His friends laughed along the way. Friends do, when they don't want to be the one who says, maybe we shouldn't. Word of it traveled the way things do on a small campus. Chloe heard it from a girl on the second floor. Hannah heard it secondhand from someone in her chemistry class. Even Renee caught wind of it through a colleague who overheard Brayden's teammates talking in the weight room. By Friday evening, a strange kind of tension had settled over parts of campus, invisible to most students, who had no idea what was brewing, but very real to the small handful of people who'd been quietly watching Joe since move-in day. Ed Whitfield reviewed the party security plan for Saturday night with more attention than usual. Renee mentioned to a few trusted colleagues that she'd be keeping an eye on things. Chloe sat on her bed Friday night, working up the nerve to say something to Joe about what she'd heard. "Joe," she finally said, "are you going to the party tomorrow?" Joe looked up from this book she was reading. "I hadn't planned on it." "You should probably know," Chloe said carefully. "People are saying Brayden's planning something. For you. At the party." Joe set her book down slowly. "What kind of something?" she asked. "I don't know exactly," Chloe admitted. "Just that he wants to embarrass you in front of everybody. Make a bigger scene than the parking lot thing." Joe sat quietly for a moment, turning the 2 broken pieces of blue elastic over in her fingers, a habit she'd developed without even noticing. "Are you going?" Joe finally asked. "I was thinking about it," Chloe said. "If you go, I'll go with you. I don't think you should be alone if something happens." Joe looked at her roommate, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since they'd moved in together. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means something." Chloe smiled, a little nervous, a little proud of herself for saying something, instead of staying silent like she usually did. Neither one of them said much else that night. But something had shifted in the room, a quiet kind of alliance, forming between 2 young women who'd started out as strangers, assigned to share 400 square feet. Joe lay awake a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to Chloe's steady breathing across the room. She thought about her grandfather's voice. "You'll know when it's the right time." She thought about the parking lot, the stairwell, the dining hall. She thought about every small cruelty Brayden had aimed at her that week, and every time she'd chosen to walk away instead of react. She wasn't afraid of tomorrow night. She was ready for it. Not because she wanted a fight, because she understood deep down in the same quiet place where her grandfather's training lived that sometimes patience runs its course. Sometimes the person doing the pushing doesn't stop until something finally pushes back. Tomorrow night at the welcome bash, under those string lights and all those watching eyes, something was going to happen. Joe didn't know exactly what yet. But for the first time since that hair tie snapped in the parking lot, she felt something other than patience settling into her chest. Readiness. She thought about the 12-year-old girl she used to be, the one who came home with a bruise she never explained. That girl had felt powerless, small, unsure of what to do with the fear sitting heavy in her chest. 6 years of quiet mornings had changed that girl into someone else entirely. Not someone who wanted trouble. Someone who simply no longer feared it the way she used to. She thought about her grandmother's voice, soft and steady, even from a hospital bed. She thought about her grandfather, probably asleep by now back home, unaware that his lessons were about to be tested in a way neither of them had planned for. She wondered briefly what Walter would say if he could see her now sitting on a dorm room bed 3 hours from home, holding 2 broken pieces of blue elastic and waiting for tomorrow. She already knew the answer. He'd tell her to trust what he taught her. He'd tell her that whatever happened tomorrow night, the goal was never to win. The goal was to protect what mattered and to walk away with a clear conscience no matter what anybody else on that quad decided to believe about her afterward. Somewhere across campus that same night, Brayden Kessler was telling his friends his plan for tomorrow, laughing confident, absolutely certain that the quiet freshman with the broken hair tie posed no threat to him whatsoever. He had no idea who her grandfather was. He had no idea what 6 years of quiet backyard mornings had built inside her. He had no idea that the girl he'd humiliated in a parking lot on move-in day was about to become the reason his entire world started coming apart. Some people choose their targets carelessly. They never stop to wonder who they're really standing in front of. Maybe that's true in more places than just a college campus. Maybe it's true of anybody who's ever mistaken someone's kindness for weakness or someone's silence for surrender. The quiet ones are so often underestimated. The ones who hold the door, who say thank you, who walk away instead of raising their voice. People assume that gentleness means there's nothing underneath it. But gentleness and strength have never been opposites. Sometimes the steadiest hands belong to the people who've had the most practice controlling them. It's a lesson a lot of us learn slowly over the course of a whole lifetime, watching quiet people surprise us again and again, until we finally stop being surprised at all. Jo Calloway wasn't raised to seek out conflict. She was raised to respect it, to understand its weight, and to know exactly when it was worth carrying. Her grandfather never taught her how to win a fight. He taught her how to recognize the difference between a fight worth avoiding and a moment where walking away simply wasn't an option anymore. Tomorrow night, under those string lights, that difference was about to become very clear to everybody on that quad. Brayden Kessler was about to learn that lesson the hard way in front of the whole campus under a string of party lights that were never meant to illuminate anything more than a good time. But that's a story for tomorrow night. For now, the campus slept unaware of what was coming. Somewhere in a quiet dorm room, a girl held 2 broken pieces of blue elastic in her palm and finally, for the first time all week, allowed herself a small, steady breath. Whatever happened next, she would meet it the way her grandfather taught her. Calm, controlled, ready. If you've ever watched somebody underestimate a quiet person and wondered how that story usually ends, stick around. Because in part 2, the welcome bash arrives, and Brayden Kessler is about to learn something about the girl he humiliated in that parking lot. Something he never bothered to ask about. Something nobody on that campus saw coming. Saturday night came the way most Saturday nights come on a college campus in late summer. Warm air, loud music. A few thousand young people who'd only known each other for 6 days, already acting like they'd grown up together. The Ashcombe State welcome bash filled the entire quad. String lights ran between the old oak trees, the kind planted back when the university was founded, thick trunks that had seen more freshman years than anyone could count. Food trucks lined the walkway near the library. A local band played covers on a small stage near the fountain, loud enough to carry across the whole green. It was the kind of night that made freshman year feel possible. Made it feel for a few hours anyway, like the nerves of the first week might finally settle into something like belonging. Families from town wandered through too. Kids running between the food trucks, grandparents sitting on benches along the edge of the quad, watching the young energy of the evening, the way older folks so often do, with a mixture of fondness and quiet worry. Jo stood near the edge of it all, close enough to see everything, far enough to stay out of the middle of it. Chloe stood beside her, true to her word. "You don't have to stay close to me all night," Jo told her. Chloe shook her head. "I know. I want to." There was something steady in the way Chloe said it. Not nervous like she usually sounded. Just certain. They found a spot near the edge of the crowd, close to one of the big oak trees, where they could watch the party without being swallowed up by it. Jo wasn't there to have fun. She wasn't there to hide either. She was there because she refused to let one person's cruelty decide where she could and couldn't go on her own campus. Her grandfather had taught her that too, without ever saying it directly. Walter Calloway never once told her to avoid a room just because trouble might be waiting in it. He taught her instead to walk into any room fully aware of what was in it and fully capable of handling whatever she found there. So she stood at that party calm, watching the same way she'd watched everything all week. Brayden found her within the first 30 minutes. He'd been drinking not a lot, just enough to loosen whatever thin restraint usually kept him from saying every thought that crossed his mind. He came walking over with 3 friends trailing behind him. The same three who'd been at his side all week, laughing at everything he said, whether it was funny or not. "Well, look who showed up," he said loud enough for people nearby to hear. "Didn't think you had it in you." Jo didn't respond. She'd learned that much already. Silence gave him less to work with than words did. Brayden didn't like being ignored. It showed on his face a flicker of irritation, quickly covered over with a grin. "Come on," he said, stepping closer. "No hard feelings about the hair tie thing, right? Just messing around." Still, Jo said nothing. One of his friends laughed. "She doesn't talk much, does she?" "Guess not," Brayden said, reaching out like he might tug at her hair again, testing to see how far he could push. This time, Jo shifted her weight just slightly enough to make it clear without a single word that his hand wasn't welcome anywhere near her. Something about that small shift landed harder than any sentence could have. Brayden pulled his hand back, covering the moment with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Relax," he muttered. "Wasn't going to do anything." He walked off with his friends toward the drink table, tossing one more comment over his shoulder that most people around them didn't quite catch. Chloe let out a breath beside Jo. "That was intense." "He's testing," Jo said quietly. "Seeing how far he can go before something stops him." "What happens when he finds out?" Chloe asked. Jo didn't answer that one. For a while, the party settled into something almost pleasant. The band played. Students danced in loose laughing groups. Somewhere near the fountain, a group of freshmen were trying to teach each other a line dance. Nobody quite remembered the steps to falling over each other and laughing about it. Jo relaxed just slightly. Chloe introduced her to a couple of girls from the floor above them, and for a few minutes it almost felt like a normal Saturday night for two 18-year-old freshmen at their first college party. At one point, Jo spotted Hannah standing near the food trucks with a small group of friends. Hannah caught her eye across the crowd and gave a small nod. Nothing more, the kind of quiet acknowledgement two people exchange when they've noticed each other's decency without ever having a real conversation about it. Jo nodded back. It didn't last. It started with a smaller freshman named Owen Pratt, a lanky, soft-spoken kid who'd made the mistake hours earlier of accidentally bumping into Brayden's roommate near the food trucks and spilling a drink down his shirt. Owen had grown up in a small farming town 2 hours west. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and where a kid like him, thoughtful, a little awkward, more comfortable with books than crowds, rarely had to worry about the kind of casual cruelty that seemed to thrive on a bigger campus. He'd come to Ashcombe State hoping to study agricultural science, following in his father's footsteps, and he'd spent his first week quietly, politely trying to figure out where he fit into a world so much bigger than the one he'd left behind. He hadn't meant to spill anything on anybody. He'd barely even registered the collision at the time, too busy apologizing and grabbing napkins to notice the look that crossed Brayden's roommate's face, the kind of look that meant a debt had just been recorded, even if nobody said so out loud. Brayden's roommate had laughed it off at the time. Brayden had not forgotten it. By the time the party reached its second hour, Brayden and two of his friends had circled back around to find Owen standing near the edge of the crowd, talking quietly with a girl from his dorm. Jo noticed it before most people did. She had a habit now of tracking Brayden's movement across a room, the same instinct her grandfather taught her for reading a space before trouble found it. She watched Brayden approach Owen, watched the easy smile on his face turn into something colder the moment he got close enough to speak. "You owe me a shirt," Brayden said loud enough to draw a small circle of attention. Owen's face went pale. "I already apologized, man. It was an accident." "Didn't sound like an apology to me," Brayden said, stepping closer using his size the way he always did, like a wall closing in on somebody smaller. The girl beside Owen tried to step between them. "Hey, come on, it's a party. Let's just—" Brayden shoved her aside, not hard, but hard enough that she stumbled and nearly fell into the crowd behind her. That was the moment things shifted. A few students nearby gasped. Somebody said his name in a low warning tone. Most people just froze the way crowds so often do, waiting to see what would happen next before deciding whether it was their place to get involved. Brayden grabbed the front of Owen's shirt with both hands, the same shirt that had been splashed with a drink hours earlier, and shoved him backward hard enough that Owen's legs buckled underneath him. Owen hit the ground, catching himself awkwardly on one wrist, wincing in pain. The crowd around them went quiet in that particular way. Crowds go quiet right before something happens, that held breath moment, where everybody's watching and nobody's moving. Jo was already moving. She didn't run. She didn't yell. She simply crossed the space between herself and the small crowd forming around Owen. With the same calm, controlled steps her grandfather had drilled into her 1,000 times. "That's enough," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something about the flatness of it, the total absence of fear, cut through the noise of the party in a way that made people nearby actually turn and look. Brayden turned toward her, surprised, then amused. Or what he said, stepping toward her now, abandoning Owen on the ground behind him. "You gonna do something about it?" He reached out, the same move he'd used in the parking lot on move-in day, going for her shoulder this time. Maybe to shove her back, maybe just to prove a point in front of everybody watching. He never got the chance to find out which. Joe's hand came up and caught his wrist before his fingers even made contact. A motion so fast and so clean that most people in the crowd didn't process what happened until it was already over. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a scream. It was something far quieter than anybody expected. And somehow that made it more startling to watch. 6 years of quiet backyard mornings had built this exact motion into her muscles so deeply that her mind barely needed to participate at all. Her grandfather's voice echoed somewhere underneath the instinct, the same reminder he'd given her 1,000 times over. Redirect, don't resist. Let his own force do the work. She turned into him, using his own forward momentum against him, redirecting his weight instead of fighting it head on, the exact principle her grandfather had spent 6 years drilling into her body until it no longer required conscious thought. Brayden's arm twisted at an angle that made him gasp, not from serious injury, but from the sudden undeniable loss of control over his own body. His knees buckled. He went down onto one knee in front of her arm, still held at an angle that made struggling against it a bad idea. The whole motion taking less than 2 seconds from start to finish. The party around them went completely silent. For a moment, nobody moved. Somewhere behind the crowd, the band kept playing, oblivious, the mismatch between the cheerful music and the tense silence near the fountain almost surreal. A phone or two came up, students instinctively reaching to record the way people so often do now when something unexpected happens in front of them. Though most hands stayed frozen halfway, unsure whether filming felt right in a moment like this. Joe held the position for one more second, long enough to make sure he understood the situation. Then released his wrist and stepped back, giving him room to stand. She didn't gloat. She didn't say anything clever. She simply stepped between Brayden and Owen, who was still sitting on the ground, cradling his wrist, and she looked down at Owen with genuine concern. "You okay?" she asked him quietly. Owen nodded too, stunned to speak. Brayden stood up slowly, cradling his own wrist, his face a mixture of pain and something much darker. Humiliation. 200 people, maybe more, had just watched the campus football captain get put on one knee by a freshman girl half his size in under 2 seconds, without her ever raising her voice. Somebody in the crowd let out a low whistle. Somebody else started clapping, uncertain at first, then a little louder when a few others joined in. Renee Coulter had been standing near the edge of the quad when it happened, close enough to see the whole thing unfold. She recognized the motion immediately, the same clean, controlled release she'd watched Joe perform on the mat that very morning. Her stomach tightened with a mixture of relief and worry. Relief that Joe had clearly known exactly what she was doing. Worry about everything that was about to follow a scene like that on a crowded quad full of witnesses with their own agendas. She didn't move toward the crowd yet. She stayed back, watching the same way Ed always seemed to watch, gathering information instead of reacting. Brayden's face went red. "You attacked me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice cracking slightly with something between anger and disbelief. Everybody saw that. "She attacked me." A few people near the front exchanged doubtful glances. Most of the crowd had watched exactly what happened, watched him shove Owen to the ground first, watched him reach for Joe second. But crowds are strange things. A loud, confident voice can sometimes overpower the truth in the moment, especially when that voice belongs to somebody used to being believed. "She's crazy." Brayden continued backing away, cradling his wrist. "Somebody call campus security. She just assaulted me." Chloe, standing near the front of the crowd, felt her stomach twist. She'd watched the whole thing happen exactly the way it happened. She knew the truth. But years of staying quiet had built a kind of reflex in her, a hesitation that kicked in even now, even watching her own roommate get accused of something she hadn't done. She didn't say anything yet. Neither did most of the crowd. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a group of witnesses when the truth and a confident lie are standing right next to each other. It isn't that people can't tell the difference. Most of them can somewhere underneath the noise and confusion of the moment. It's that speaking up costs something, and most people in that split second decide the cost is too high to pay for somebody they barely know. That's not cowardice, not exactly. It's something more human than that. Fear of being wrong. Fear of drawing attention. Fear of standing alone against a version of events that a loud, confident voice keeps insisting is true. It takes a particular kind of courage to be the first person to say out loud what everybody else is quietly thinking. Most crowds wait for somebody else to go first. That night, standing near the fountain, nobody went first. Owen, still sitting on the ground, opened his mouth to say something to defend Joe. But one of Brayden's friends stepped close to him, leaning down with a quiet word that made Owen's face go pale again. "Don't," the friend muttered. "You don't want to be involved in this." Owen closed his mouth. Within minutes, 2 campus security officers arrived, drawn by the commotion radios crackling at their hips. Ed Whitfield was one of them. He'd been stationed near the food trucks that night, keeping an eye on things the way he always did during big campus events. He'd heard the commotion from 50 yards away and made his way over as fast as his bad back allowed. By the time he arrived, Brayden was already telling his version of the story to the other officer, loud and confident, gesturing at his wrist like it had been broken instead of simply twisted for 2 seconds. "She came out of nowhere and attacked me," Brayden said. "Ask anybody. I didn't even touch her." Ed looked past Brayden toward Joe, who stood quietly near Owen, helping him to his feet, checking his wrist with a gentleness that told Ed everything he needed to know about what kind of person he was looking at. He looked at Owen's face, pale and shaken. He looked at the small crowd still murmuring around them. Some faces uncertain, some faces angry, a few faces already whispering the truth to each other in low voices that hadn't yet found the courage to speak up loudly. Ed had spent 22 years learning to separate truth from noise in exactly these kinds of chaotic moments. He didn't like what his instincts were telling him about which version of this story was actually true. But procedure was procedure. 2 students involved in a physical altercation at a campus event, dozens of witnesses, no immediate injuries, requiring an ambulance. His job in this moment wasn't to determine guilt on the spot. His job was to separate everybody involved, gather information, and let it go through the proper channels. He walked over to Joe first, his voice calm and even. "Miss Calloway," he said gently, "I need you to come with me for a moment. We're going to sort this out." Joe nodded unshaken and followed him without protest. As they walked away from the crowd, Ed glanced back once at Brayden, who was still talking loudly to the other officer, still cradling his wrist with theatrical care, still playing the crowd like he'd been doing it his whole life. Something about the performance of it all sat wrong with Ed. He'd seen plenty of genuine victims over the years. Genuine victims usually didn't look quite that composed while accusing somebody. But he kept those thoughts to himself for now. Walking Joe toward the security office, at the edge of the quad, the music from the party still playing behind them, like nothing had happened at all. The next morning brought a very different kind of tension to campus. Word of what happened at the welcome bash had spread overnight, the way things always spread on a small campus, faster and messier than the truth could ever keep up with. By breakfast, there were at least 4 different versions circulating through the dining hall. In one version, Joe had attacked Brayden, unprovoked, jealous over something nobody could quite explain. In another, Brayden had simply been defending himself against a freshman with anger issues. A smaller, quieter version, whispered mostly among the students who'd actually been standing close enough to see clearly, told the true story. Brayden had shoved a smaller student to the ground, and Joe had stepped in to stop it. That version didn't travel nearly as fast as the others. It never does. Dean Foster arrived at his office Monday morning to find an incident report waiting on his desk filed the night before by campus security, along with a voicemail from Brayden Kessler that had come in at 11:45 the previous night, barely an hour after the altercation occurred. Foster listened to the voicemail twice before deleting it, his jaw tight. He thought briefly about a version of himself 20 years younger. The one who'd taken this job believing fairness was mostly a matter of following the rules closely enough. That younger man would have been furious at a voicemail like this one. The man he'd become mostly just felt tired, the particular tiredness of watching a familiar pattern repeat itself one more time. Brayden Kessler's voice on the recording hadn't been panicked or worried about his son's well-being. It had been something closer to controlled fury, demanding to know why a freshman girl had been allowed to assault a student-athlete on campus grounds, demanding immediate action, reminding Foster in a tone that left little room for misunderstanding exactly how much the Kessler family had contributed to the university over the years. Foster sat at his desk a long moment after the voicemail ended, staring at the incident report in front of him. He'd been dean of students long enough to recognize the shape of what was happening. A powerful family, a serious allegation, and a young woman with far less institutional weight behind her than the boy accusing her. He picked up his phone and called campus security requesting the footage from the quad cameras covering the area near the fountain where the incident occurred. That request would turn out to matter more than Foster could have guessed that Monday morning. Ed Whitfield spent his Sunday off duty thinking about what he'd seen the night before, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. He'd taken Joe's statement himself after separating her from the crowd, and her account had been calm, direct, and consistent in every detail. She described exactly what she saw, exactly what she did, and exactly why she did it, without a single moment of exaggeration or self-pity. Owen's account, once Ed finally got him alone, away from Brayden's friends, matched hers point for point. Brayden's account kept shifting slightly every time Ed asked him to repeat it. Small inconsistencies in the timeline that experienced officers learned to notice. Ed had seen enough over the years to trust his instincts on something like this. But instincts weren't proof. Proof required evidence, and the best evidence available was sitting on a server somewhere captured by the security camera positioned near the fountain, exactly where the altercation had taken place. Monday afternoon, Ed logged into the security system to pull the footage himself, wanting to review it before anybody else did, wanting to understand exactly what those cameras had captured. He found something he didn't expect. The footage from Saturday night between the hours of 9:30 and 10:15, the exact window covering the entire Welcome Bash incident, was corrupted. Not missing entirely. Corrupted. A strange, deliberate-looking gap in an otherwise perfectly functioning recording system. The kind of gap that didn't happen by accident in Ed's 22 years of experience with exactly this kind of technology. He sat back in his chair staring at the error message on the screen, feeling something cold settle into his stomach. Cameras didn't just happen to malfunction for 45 minutes on the one night when the footage actually mattered. Somebody had touched this. Ed spent the next hour digging through system logs, the kind of quiet, patient work that had defined most of his career. The unglamorous part of investigation that television shows never bothered depicting. Most of his colleagues in security weren't trained to look this closely at system access logs. Ed was. He'd learned the habit years ago back on the force working a string of burglaries where the evidence that mattered most was never the obvious stuff, the broken window or the missing television. It was the quiet stuff. The timestamp on a phone record, the gap in a security log that shouldn't have existed. Most people rushed past those details looking for something dramatic. Ed had learned that the truth usually hid in the boring parts nobody bothered to check twice. He pulled up the full server access history for the week, cross-referencing timestamps against the university's staff directory, checking each login against a normal pattern of activity. Most of what he found was exactly what he expected. Routine maintenance, scheduled backups, A handful of ordinary logins from the regular IT staff running through their normal Saturday checks. Then he found the anomaly. What he found troubled him even more. The system showed an administrative login accessing the security server at 8:57 that evening, more than half an hour before the incident even occurred, and again at 10:20 shortly after it ended. The login credentials belonged to a name Ed didn't immediately recognize. A staff member in the university's information technology department named Russell Dahl. Ed didn't know Russell Dahl personally. But a quick search through the university directory turned up something that made the cold feeling in his stomach settle in even deeper. Russell Dahl's wife worked as an administrative assistant in Brayden Kessler's city council office. Ed sat with that information for a long time, staring at his computer screen, weighing exactly what it might mean and exactly how careful he needed to be about what he did next. He wasn't ready to accuse anybody of anything yet. A shared last name and a spouse's job weren't proof of a conspiracy. Coincidences happened. But 22 years on the force had taught Ed one thing above almost everything else. Coincidences involving powerful families and missing evidence deserved a much closer look before anybody dismissed them. He printed out the access logs, quietly made a copy for himself, and said nothing to anyone yet, not even to Renee. Not until he had more than a hunch to bring to the table. Meanwhile, Joe's Monday unfolded in a way that felt like the walls of the campus slowly closing in around her. She'd been called into Dean Foster's office first thing that morning, a summons that arrived through a terse email sent late Sunday night. She walked across campus with a strange, hollow calm settled over her, the same calm her grandfather had trained into her years ago, the kind of stillness that comes from accepting whatever happens next without letting fear make the decision for you. Dean Foster's office was small, cluttered with paperwork, a single window overlooking the quad where the party had happened just 2 nights before. Framed photos lined one shelf. Foster shaking hands with graduating students over the years. A reminder of the part of his job that still felt meaningful, even on days like this one, when the rest of it felt like navigating a minefield. "Miss Calloway," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." Joe sat. Foster folded his hands on the desk, choosing his words carefully. "I've received a complaint regarding an incident at the Welcome Bash Saturday night. I want to hear your account of what happened." Joe told him, calmly, clearly exactly what she'd told Ed 2 nights earlier. Brayden shoving Owen to the ground, her stepping in to stop it. Brayden grabbing for her, her defensive response controlled brief, causing no lasting injury. Foster listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, occasionally jotting a note on the legal pad in front of him. When she finished, he set his pen down and studied her for a moment. "I've read a lot of incident reports over the years," he said slowly. "I've learned to notice when somebody's account sounds rehearsed versus when it sounds like the truth. Yours sounds like the truth, Miss Calloway. I want you to know that." Something in Joe's chest loosened slightly at that, the first small comfort she'd felt since Saturday night. "Then why am I the one being suspended?" she asked, not with anger, just genuine confusion. Foster sighed, rubbing his temple. "Because policy doesn't run on what I personally believe," he said. "It runs on documented evidence and formal complaints. Right now, I have a formal complaint from Mr. Kessler, conflicting witness accounts and no video evidence to settle the matter definitively. Given the seriousness of the allegation, university policy requires me to place you on interim suspension while this matter is investigated. I want you to understand that's a procedural requirement, not a judgment about who's telling the truth." Joe felt something tighten in her chest, though her face didn't change. "I was protecting another student," she said quietly. "He was already on the ground before I did anything." "I understand that's your account," Foster said, and something in his voice suggested he genuinely did believe her, even as policy forced his hand in a different direction. "But I have a complaint on file from a council member's son, conflicting witness statements, and no clear video evidence to settle the matter one way or another." "There should be footage," Joe said. There were cameras right there. Foster's expression flickered, something guarded, passing behind his eyes. "Security is reviewing the footage now," he said carefully. As soon as that's available, it will factor heavily into how we proceed. Until then, I need you to stay off campus grounds outside of essential coursework and avoid any contact with Mr. Kessler or his associates. Jo sat with that for a long moment, the unfairness of it settling over her like a weight she hadn't expected to carry so soon into her first semester. She thought about walking away, about calling her grandfather right there in that office and telling him she'd made a mistake coming here, that maybe some places just weren't built for people like her to get a fair shot. But that thought passed, quickly replaced by something steadier. She hadn't done anything wrong. She knew that, with total certainty. And her grandfather had taught her that certainty, real certainty built on truth rather than pride, was worth holding on to, even when everything around you seemed determined to convince you otherwise. "How long does an investigation like this usually take?" she asked quietly. Foster hesitated. "There's a disciplinary hearing scheduled for next Monday. That gives us 9 days from the original incident to gather whatever evidence exists. I'll be honest with you, Miss Calloway. I don't yet know how this is going to unfold, but I intend to find out the truth, whatever it turns out to be." Jo nodded and stood to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back. "Owen was there too," she said. "He'll tell you what really happened if you ask him." Foster made a note on his desk. "I intend to." Jo left the office and stepped out into the September sunlight campus, buzzing around her with students heading to their Monday classes. None of them aware that the quiet freshman walking past them had just been suspended from the very place she'd hoped only a week earlier might finally feel like home. She sat down on a bench near the administration building and called her grandfather. He answered on the first ring this time. "Walter?" she said, her voice steady, even though her hands weren't quite. "I need to tell you what happened." She told him everything. The party, Owen, the wrist lock, the accusation, the suspension. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when she finished. "You did exactly what I taught you to do," Walter finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "You protected somebody who couldn't protect himself, and you used exactly the amount of force necessary to do it, not 1 ounce more." "I got suspended anyway," Jo said. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you something before it pays you back," Walter said. "That's not fair. It's just true. The question now isn't whether you did the right thing. You did. The question is whether the truth gets the chance to catch up before it's too late." "What if it doesn't?" Jo asked quietly. Walter was quiet for a moment before answering. "Then we make sure it does," he said. "You're not alone in this, kiddo. More people are paying attention than you probably realize." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened into something closer to the tone he used to use in the backyard all those quiet mornings ago, correcting her stance, encouraging her through a technique she hadn't quite mastered yet. "Your grandmother used to say something about times like this," he said. "She used to say that character isn't what you do when everybody's watching and cheering you on. Character is what you do when doing the right thing costs you something and nobody's applauding yet." Jo felt her eyes sting slightly at the mention of her grandmother. A small ache she carried everywhere, now softened only a little by time. "I miss her," Jo said quietly. "Me too," Walter said. "Every single day. But I'll tell you this. If she could see what you did at that party, stepping in for a kid you barely knew, expecting nothing in return, she'd be prouder of you than she ever was of me." Jo held the phone a little tighter, comforted despite everything. They stayed on the line a while longer, neither one in a hurry to hang up the way people sometimes linger on a call when the conversation itself has become the comfort rather than anything specific being said. Walter told her about the weather back home, about a stray dog that had taken to sleeping on the porch some nights. Small ordinary details that reminded Jo the world outside this campus was still turning the way it always had, waiting patiently for her to come back to it. Jo thought of Ed Whitfield's careful, watchful presence. She thought of Renee Coulter's knowing look in the gym. She thought of Chloe standing beside her at the party, and Owen sitting on the ground, shaken but honest. Maybe her grandfather was right. Maybe she wasn't as alone in this as it felt sitting on that bench. But 9 days suddenly felt like a very short amount of time. Back in the dorm that evening, Chloe found Joe sitting quietly on her bed, staring at nothing in particular. The room felt smaller than usual, the way rooms sometimes do when something heavy has settled into them. Chloe stood in the doorway a moment before stepping inside, closing the door softly behind her, like she was worried about disturbing something fragile. "I heard," Chloe said softly, "about the suspension. I'm so sorry." Joe nodded, but didn't say much. Chloe sat down on the edge of her own bed, wringing her hands together, clearly working up the courage to say something. "I should have said something Saturday night," she finally admitted. "When Brayden started yelling that you attacked him. I knew the truth. I saw the whole thing. I just froze." Joe looked over at her roommate, something gentle in her expression, despite everything. "It's hard to speak up in a moment like that," she said. "I understand." "That's the thing," Chloe said, her voice cracking slightly. "I've understood that same excuse my whole life, and it's never once made me feel better about staying quiet." She wiped at her eyes, embarrassed, and continued. "Back in high school, there was a boy," she said quietly. "Everybody knew what was happening to him. I knew. I watched it happen for 2 years and told myself it wasn't my place to get involved. He stopped coming to school eventually. I never even found out what happened to him after that. I think about him sometimes. Wonder if things would have gone differently if just one person had said something." Joe listened quietly, letting her roommate work through it at her own pace. "I don't want to be that person again," Chloe said, her voice steadier now. "I actually got some of it on video. Not the whole thing. My phone was in my pocket, and I fumbled it out partway through, but I think I caught the part where he shoved Owen down. And some of what happened right after." Joe sat up straighter. "You have that on your phone?" Chloe nodded. "I didn't say anything about it yet. I don't know why. I guess I was scared of what happens if I hand it over, and everybody turns on me the way they'd probably turn on you." Joe reached over and took her roommate's hand, an unusual gesture for someone who rarely reached for physical comfort. But it felt necessary in that moment. "You don't have to decide tonight," Joe said quietly. "But whenever you're ready, that video might be the only thing that gets the truth in front of the people who need to see it." Chloe nodded, still shaken. But something in her posture had changed slightly, like a small weight had shifted, even if it hadn't fully lifted yet. Across campus that same evening, Ed Whitfield sat in his small apartment. The printed access log spread across his kitchen table, a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He thought about calling Renee. He thought about calling Dean Foster directly. He thought about a dozen different ways to move forward, weighing each one carefully against the risk of moving too fast, of tipping his hand before he had enough to actually make a difference. In the end, he decided on something simple. He'd keep digging quietly, patiently, the way he'd learned to do over 22 years of careful work. He'd build a case brick by brick, instead of shouting an accusation he couldn't yet fully prove. He looked at the calendar hanging on his kitchen wall. The disciplinary hearing date circled in red ink, 8 days away now. 8 days to find out exactly what Russell Dahl had done to that footage and exactly why. 8 days to make sure a quiet, decent young woman who'd done nothing wrong except protect somebody weaker than herself didn't end up paying the price for somebody else's cowardice and somebody else's cover-up. Ed finished his cold coffee, gathered his notes, and got to work. He thought not for the first time that week about the reasons he'd taken this job in the first place. Not for the paycheck. Not really for anything to do besides sit at home missing Linda more than he already did. He'd taken it because some part of him still believed that paying close attention mattered, that a person willing to notice the small details other people rushed past could still do some good in the world, even after the badge was gone. Tonight, sitting alone at his kitchen table with a young woman's future spread out in front of him in the form of printed access logs, that belief felt like it was finally about to be tested. Renee Coulter heard about the suspension Monday afternoon, the news reaching her the way most campus news reached her through a colleague in the athletics department who mentioned it almost in passing between other topics, unaware of how much it would matter to her. She sat in her office after her last class of the day, staring at her phone, debating whether to call Ed. She thought about Walter Calloway again, about that seminar years ago, about the quiet respect he'd commanded from a room full of much larger, much louder men, simply by being exactly who he was, no more, no less. She thought about his granddaughter, now suspended from her own campus, for doing exactly what any decent person should do when they see someone getting hurt. Renee picked up her phone and called Ed. He answered on the second ring. "You heard," he said, "not really a question." "I heard," Renee confirmed. "This isn't right, Ed. I watched that girl in my class Saturday morning. She's not reckless. She's about as controlled as anybody I've ever trained. Whatever happened at that party, I'd bet everything I have that she only did what was necessary." "I agree with you," Ed said, "and I think I might have found something that backs that up. But I need more time before I bring it to anybody official. I don't want to accuse somebody without proof, especially not somebody connected to a family with the kind of reach the Kesslers have around here." Renee was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Keep an eye on her," Ed said. "Not in a way that makes her feel watched. Just be somebody she knows is in her corner. These next few days are going to be hard on her, and it helps to know somebody believes you when everybody else seems to be doubting you." "I can do that," Renee said. They talked a few minutes longer, Ed sharing just enough about the corrupted footage to give Renee some hope without revealing the full extent of what he suspected, still cautious about who knew what until he had something solid enough to act on. After they hung up, Renee sat in her office a while longer, thinking about all the students who'd passed through her classes over the years. Most of them forgettable in the ordinary way. Most of us are forgettable, blending into the general rush of young people finding their way through 4 years of growing up. Josephine Calloway was not going to be one of the forgettable ones. Renee felt certain of that already, even without knowing exactly how the rest of this story would unfold. She thought about calling Joe directly, just to check in, but decided against it for tonight. Some comfort is better offered through steady presence than through words, and Renee intended to be steady presence enough over the coming week to matter without crowding a young woman who'd already had more than enough people crowding her this week. Somewhere across town, in a house with his name on half the buildings downtown, Gordon Kessler poured himself a drink and told himself, the way powerful men so often do, that everything was already handled. He had no idea how wrong he was about to be. If you've ever watched somebody powerful assume that money and influence would quietly make a problem disappear, you already know how these stories tend to end. Truth has a strange kind of patience. It doesn't announce itself right away. It waits quietly, gathering itself in unexpected places, in a security guard's careful notes, in a roommate's shaking hands, holding a phone, in the steady conscience of a young woman who refuses to let fear decide who she becomes. 8 days remained before the hearing that would decide Joe Calloway's future at Ashcombe State. 8 days for a corrupted piece of footage to somehow find its way back into the light. 8 days for a frightened roommate to find the courage she'd been missing her whole life. 8 days for a family used to getting exactly what it wanted to discover that some things in the end simply can't be bought. In part 3, all of it comes to a head. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. And sometimes when it finally surfaces, it brings someone along with it that nobody in that hearing room ever expected to walk through the door. Sunday night, the night before the hearing, Jo sat on her bed with her suitcase half packed. She hadn't told Chloe yet. She hadn't told anybody, not even her grandfather. 8 days of waiting had worn her down in a way physical training never had. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being disbelieved, from watching people you don't even know whisper theories about your character, based on nothing but a rumor and a confident liar's voice. It isn't the kind of tired sleep fixes. It wasn't the first time in her life she'd felt this particular kind of tired. She remembered feeling something close to it the week after her grandmother's funeral. That same sense of the world moving forward around her, while some part of her stayed frozen in place, unable to catch up. Grief and injustice weren't the same thing, but they shared a certain weight, the way both of them asked you to keep functioning normally while carrying something most people around you couldn't see. She'd spent the week going to the classes she was still permitted to attend, avoiding the ones that overlapped with Brayden's schedule, eating meals alone at odd hours to avoid the stairs in the dining hall. Owen had tried to talk to her twice that week, both times pulled aside by one of Brayden's friends before he could finish a sentence. Hannah had nodded at her once in a hallway, a small, careful gesture that meant more than Joe could explain, though neither of them said a word. The suspension itself had been lifted from her academic record, pending the outcome of the hearing, technically allowing her back into most classes, but the social weight of it followed her everywhere regardless. She noticed the way conversations dropped slightly when she walked into a room. She noticed the way some students went out of their way to avoid eye contact, as though whatever had happened to her might somehow be contagious. A few students, mostly the ones who'd actually witnessed the truth at the party, offered small kindnesses when nobody else was looking, a nod in the hallway. A held door gestures too small to draw attention, but large enough for Joe to notice and hold on to. It hadn't been enough. Not against the version of events being repeated in every corner of campus, the one where a scholarship football captain got attacked without provocation by an unstable freshman. Nobody really knew. Joe folded another shirt into her suitcase. She thought about her parents back home, about the conversation she'd eventually have to have with them if she withdrew from Ashcombe State only 3 weeks into her first semester. She thought about the disappointment they'd never actually voice, but that she'd feel anyway, underneath their reassurances that everything would work out fine wherever she landed next. Maybe some places just weren't meant for people like her. She was still folding when her phone rang. It was Walter. She almost didn't answer. She didn't want him to hear the defeat in her voice, didn't want to disappoint the man who'd spent 6 years building something in her that felt tonight like it hadn't been enough after all. She answered anyway. "Hey, kiddo." Walter said, his voice warm as always. "Just checking in before tomorrow." Joe sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. "I don't think it's going to go well," she said quietly. "I've been packing, just in case." There was a pause on the line long enough that Joe wondered if the call had dropped. "Tell me something," Walter finally said. "Did you do anything wrong at that party?" "No," Joe said. "Then why are you packing a suitcase instead of your evidence?" he asked, not unkindly, but firm enough to cut through the fog she'd been sitting in all evening. "I don't have evidence," Joe said. "That's the problem. It's my word against his, and his word comes with a lot more weight behind it than mine does." Walter was quiet again, and when he spoke, something in his tone had shifted steady and certain in a way that reminded her of standing in the backyard all those mornings, waiting for him to correct her stance. "You've spent 6 years learning that the fight isn't always about being the strongest person in the room," he said. "Sometimes it's about outlasting the moment when everybody else has already decided you've lost. Don't pack that suitcase tonight. Trust that the truth is still working even when you can't see exactly how yet." Joe looked at the half-packed suitcase sitting open on her bed. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," Walter repeated. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to need you steady, not exhausted." They said goodnight, and Joe sat a long moment after hanging up, looking at the 2 broken pieces of blue elastic sitting on her desk where they'd sat all semester. She put the suitcase away. Across campus that same night, Ed Whitfield was not sleeping either. He'd spent the past week building his case piece by piece, exactly the way he'd learned to over 22 years on the force. Quiet requests to old contacts in the department. A conversation with a records clerk he'd known for 15 years, who owed him a favor from a case long forgotten by everybody but the 2 of them. A long, careful conversation with Russell Dahl himself, conducted not as an accusation, but as a simple, friendly check-in about a technical glitch in the security system. He'd found Russell in the small IT office tucked away in the basement of the administration building, surrounded by server racks and the low hum of cooling fans. Ed had brought 2 cups of coffee, an old habit from his days conducting interviews. The kind of small gesture that reminded a nervous person they weren't necessarily in trouble, at least not yet, and that made room for an honest conversation instead of a defensive one. He'd started slow, asking about the general reliability of the campus security system, easing into questions about the specific outage from the Welcome Bash weekend, almost as an afterthought. Russell Dahl had not handled that conversation well. He'd stumbled over his words, avoided eye contact, and eventually admitted quietly, almost relieved, to finally say it out loud, that Gordon Kessler's office had reached out to his wife the Sunday morning after the party, asking as a favor whether anything could be done about footage that might make things complicated for the councilman's son. Russell hadn't wanted to do it. He'd told Ed that more than once, like repeating it might make it feel less true. His wife's job depended on staying in Gordon Kessler's good graces, he explained, voice shaking slightly. There'd been an implied understanding. Nothing stated outright that budget approvals for his own department might not go as smoothly if the family found itself frustrated with the university. He'd given Ed a written statement, signed and dated, admitting exactly what he'd done and exactly who had asked him to do it. Ed had thanked him, told him honestly that coming forward now, even late, mattered, and left the basement office with the single most important piece of paper he'd handled since retiring from the force. Ed sat with that statement now spread across his kitchen table alongside the access logs he'd printed the week before, and felt something settle in his chest that was equal parts relief and dread. Relief because the truth had finally surfaced. Dread because tomorrow was going to be difficult for a lot of people, and Ed had never taken any pleasure in watching that kind of reckoning unfold, even when it was deserved. He called Renee before turning in for the night. "I've got what we need," he told her. "Good," Renee said, "because I think Chloe's finally ready too." Chloe had spent the week wrestling with something that had nothing to do with courage in the way most people imagine it. It wasn't about being brave enough to face danger. It was about being brave enough to face the version of herself she'd have to live with afterward, the version who either spoke up when it mattered or stayed silent one more time. She'd watched the footage on her phone at least a dozen times that week, replaying it in the quiet hours after Joe fell asleep, studying every frame, like it might tell her what to do if she just looked closely enough. It never told her anything new. The truth in that footage had been clear from the very first viewing. She simply hadn't been ready to accept what sharing it might cost her. Sunday night, after Joe had gone to bed, Chloe sat in the dim light of her desk lamp and finally called her mother back home, the first time she'd told anybody in her family about any of this. Her mother had raised her mostly alone after Chloe's father moved out when Chloe was 9. And somewhere in those years, she'd developed a habit of listening all the way through, before offering anything close to advice, a patience Chloe had never fully appreciated until she needed it herself. Her mother listened to the whole story, without interrupting the way mothers sometimes do when they can tell their child needs to talk more than they need advice. When Chloe finished, her mother asked one simple question. "What kind of person do you want to be when you look back on this?" In 20 years, Chloe didn't have a quick answer. But somewhere in the silence that followed, she found one anyway. Not the kind who watched it happen and said nothing. She said quietly, "Then you already know what to do," her mother said gently. Chloe hung up the phone and sat there a long moment, working up her nerve. Then she pulled out her laptop, uploaded the video from her phone, and drafted an email to Dean Foster, attaching the footage, along with a written statement, describing exactly what she'd witnessed at the welcome bash. Her hand shook slightly as she hit send just after midnight, 8 hours before the hearing was scheduled to begin. She didn't wake Joe to tell her. She wanted to see it through fully on her own, first wanted to know she'd made the choice for the right reasons rather than for credit or comfort. She lay awake a long time after that, staring at the ceiling, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace of a kind. The particular peace that comes only from finally doing the thing you should have done all along. Monday morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of early autumn day that hints at the season changing. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in a conference room adjacent to Dean Foster's office, a formal enough space with a long table, several chairs arranged around it, and a projector screen mounted on the far wall that rarely got used for anything more dramatic than budget presentations. Somebody had set out a pitcher of water and a stack of paper cups at the center of the table. The kind of small, ordinary gesture that made the whole room feel simultaneously official and strangely mundane, as though the outcome of a young woman's entire college career might hinge on a conversation held in the same kind of room where the university usually discussed parking permits and dining hall menus. Today would be different. The hallway outside the conference room felt different, too quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when everybody involved understands that something important is about to happen, even if most of them don't yet know how it will end. A handful of students lingered near the far end of the hall, pretending to check their phones, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, even though they had no official reason to be there. Jo arrived 15 minutes early, dressed simply, her hair pulled back with an ordinary rubber band, the two broken pieces of her grandmother's blue hair tie tucked carefully into her jacket pocket close to her heart, the way they'd been all semester. She'd barely slept the night before, not from the same defeated exhaustion of the previous evening, but from a different kind of restlessness entirely. The nervous anticipation of finally having a chance to be heard by people willing to actually listen. Chloe walked in beside her, quiet but resolute, having finally told Jo everything the night before over breakfast, watching relief and gratitude pass across her roommate's face in a way that made every ounce of fear worth pushing through. Owen sat near the back of the room when they arrived, having been asked to appear as a witness, his parents having driven 2 hours that morning after he'd finally called them the week before and told them everything. Dean Foster sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 other faculty members, serving on the disciplinary panel, a stack of paperwork in front of him that had grown considerably since the previous Monday. Brayden arrived a few minutes later with his father beside him. Brayden Kessler moved through the hallway like a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. Shaking hands with faculty members, he recognized, offering a confident smile to anyone who made eye contact. He wore an expensive suit that fit the part of a man used to boardrooms and campaign photographs. His silver hair combed back neatly, every gesture practiced and deliberate, the product of decades spent learning exactly how to command a room without seeming to try. Brayden walked beside him, chin up, wearing an expression that suggested he considered this whole proceeding a formality he'd already won. He'd worn his Letterman jacket that morning, an odd choice for a disciplinary hearing, though Jo suspected it was less about comfort and more about reminding everyone in the room exactly who he believed himself to be. The 2 of them took seats across the table from Jo, close enough that Jo could see for the first time a flicker of something uncertain behind Brayden's confident posture. Not quite fear. Something closer to the discomfort of a person who'd told a story so many times he'd nearly convinced himself it was true, standing now in a room about to test that conviction. Dean Foster called the hearing to order at precisely 10 o'clock. "We're here to review the incident that occurred at the welcome bash on Saturday evening," he began, his voice formal but steady. "Given the seriousness of the allegations on both sides, I want to make clear that this panel's only interest is establishing what actually happened. Nothing more, nothing less." Brayden Kessler leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Dean Foster, my son has already provided a clear account corroborated by multiple witnesses. I'd hoped this matter would have been resolved before it reached this stage." Foster met his gaze evenly. "Multiple accounts have been conflicting, Mr. Kessler. That's precisely why we're here." He turned to Jo. "Miss Calloway, would you please restate for the record your account of the events in question?" Jo told her story again, the same account she'd given a week earlier, steady and unwavering, describing exactly what she'd seen and exactly what she'd done, no embellishment, no exaggeration. Brayden interrupted, twice both times, cut off gently but firmly, by Dean Foster reminding him he'd have his turn to respond. When Jo finished, Foster turned to Owen. "Mr. Pratt," he said, "would you tell us what you witnessed?" Owen's voice shook slightly at first, but steadied as he spoke, describing being shoved to the ground, describing Jo stepping in, describing the brief, controlled nature of what happened next. Brayden shook his head, throughout muttering something under his breath that his father quieted with a firm hand on his arm. Foster nodded, made a note, and then looked toward the back of the room. "There is one more matter I'd like to address before we hear Mr. Kessler's account," he said. He gestured toward a laptop connected to the projector at the front of the room. "Late last night, my office received video evidence from a witness present at the welcome bash. I'd like to review it now with the panel's permission." Brayden Kessler's expression shifted for the first time, something tightening around his eyes. "Video evidence," he repeated. "From whom?" "From Miss Bennett," Foster said, nodding toward Chloe. "Miss Calloway's roommate." Brayden's face went pale. Foster dimmed the lights and started the video. The footage was shaky, filmed from an angle partially obscured by the crowd, but the important moments were unmistakably clear. Brayden shoving Owen to the ground, hard, unprovoked. The girl beside Owen, stumbling after being pushed aside. Jo stepping forward, her voice calm on the recording. That's enough cutting through the noise of the party. Brayden reaching for her. The brief, controlled motion of her response, Brayden going down to one knee, released within seconds, standing up immediately afterward, uninjured beyond a moment of wounded pride. The room sat in silence as the video ended. "That's edited," Brayden said quickly, his voice rising. "That doesn't show the whole thing. She provoked me earlier that night. Everybody saw that." Foster raised a hand. "We have accounted for the full timeline, Mr. Kessler, including witness statements describing your earlier interactions with Miss Calloway that evening. None of them describe provocation on her part." Gordon Kessler leaned forward, his composure fraying slightly at the edges. "This is a single video from a single source clearly sympathetic to Miss Calloway's account. I'd like to know why the university's own security footage from that night hasn't been presented instead." Foster held his gaze for a long moment. "That's an excellent question," he said quietly. "And it brings me to the next matter this panel needs to discuss." He nodded toward the door where Ed Whitfield had been waiting just outside. Ed walked in carrying a folder, his expression calm but serious, the same steady expression he'd worn through 22 years of testifying in situations far more difficult than this one. "Mr. Whitfield oversees campus security footage," Foster explained to the panel. "He has some findings relevant to this hearing." Ed opened his folder and began speaking methodical and clear, the way he'd learned to present evidence over decades of experience. "The security footage covering the incident window from Saturday night was found to be corrupted," he said. "Upon investigation, I discovered this was not a technical malfunction. It was the result of deliberate access to the university's server system by a member of the information technology staff." He placed the printed access logs on the table. "That staff member has provided a signed, written statement confirming he was asked to interfere with the footage." Ed slid a second document across the table. "Asked by whom?" Foster asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer and simply wanted it on the record. Ed looked directly at Gordon Kessler as he answered. "According to the statement, the request came through your office, Mr. Kessler, specifically through your administrative assistant, whose husband happens to be the IT staff member in question." The room went completely still. Gordon Kessler's face had gone from confident to pale to something harder, something cornered. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice rising. "You're accusing me in front of this panel based on the word of some disgruntled employee." Ed remained calm. "I understand this is difficult to hear, Mr. Kessler. But the statement is signed, dated, and corroborated by the access logs I've provided. I'd encourage the panel to review both documents carefully." Foster picked up the statement, reading it slowly, his expression growing more troubled with each line. Brayden sat frozen beside his father, his earlier confidence completely drained from his face. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke. Then the door at the back of the conference room opened. An older man walked in, unhurried, dressed simply in a plain button-down shirt and a worn but well-kept jacket, moving with the quiet, grounded presence of somebody who'd spent a lifetime commanding respect without ever needing to raise his voice to get it. He had the kind of weathered, kind face that seemed to belong equally to a church pew and a training gym. Deep lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent outdoors, and hands that even now folded calmly in front of him looked like they'd done careful, purposeful work for a very long time. Jo turned in her seat, and for the first time since the hearing began, something other than steady composure crossed her face. "Grandpa," she said softly, her voice catching slightly on the word. Walter Calloway nodded to her, a small warm smile crossing his face despite the tension in the room, before turning his attention to Dean Foster. He'd driven through the night after her call, stopping only once, for gas and coffee arriving on campus, with barely enough time to find the right building before the hearing began. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "My name is Walter Calloway. I understand there's a hearing underway regarding my granddaughter, and given the nature of the allegations, I felt it was important to be here in person. Foster stood extending a hand. Mr. Calloway, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us. I wasn't planning to, Walter admitted, shaking his hand. But when my granddaughter told me last night she was packing her bags, instead of trusting the truth to catch up, I decided the least I could do was drive 3 hours to make sure it did. One of the other panel members, an older professor who'd sat mostly silent through the proceedings, looked up sharply at the name. Walter Calloway, he repeated slowly. The same Walter Calloway who ran defensive tactics training for the Regional Police Academy. Walter nodded. That's right. The professor's expression shifted into something like recognition mixed with quiet respect. I attended one of your seminars years ago as a favor to a friend on the force. I've never forgotten it. You taught us that real strength doesn't need an audience to prove itself. Walter offered a small, humble nod. I try to live by that, and I raised my granddaughter the same way. Brayden Kessler, sensing the room shifting further away from him, tried one last time to regain control of the narrative. With respect, he said, none of this changes what happened at that party. My son was physically restrained by a freshman girl in front of hundreds of witnesses. Walter turned to face him directly, calm, unshaken. The same steady presence that had commanded respect in training rooms for 30 years. I trained my granddaughter myself. Starting when she was 12 years old, he said. Every single technique she knows exists for one purpose only, to protect someone herself or somebody else, without causing unnecessary harm. I've watched the video your own witnesses provided. What I saw was a young woman stopping a bigger, stronger young man from hurting somebody weaker than himself, using the absolute minimum force required to do it safely. He paused, letting the words settle over the room. If your son had simply walked away when she gave him the chance, none of us would be sitting in this room today. Brayden's composure finally cracked. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he said, his voice suddenly smaller than it had sounded all week. I don't know. I didn't like that she wasn't scared of me. Nobody's ever not scared of me. The room went quiet again this time, not from shock, but from something closer to recognition. The truth finally spoken plainly without the armor of confidence or influence protecting it. Foster leaned forward. Mr. Kessler, did you shove Mr. Pratt to the ground that night without provocation? Brayden's eyes dropped to the table. Yes, he admitted quietly. And did you reach for Miss Calloway after she intervened with the intention of physically confronting her? A long pause. Yes, Brayden said, barely above a whisper. Brayden Kessler opened his mouth to interject, but the older professor on the panel raised a hand, silencing him with a single sharp look. I think your son has answered the question, sir, the professor said. Perhaps it's time to let him. Foster continued, his tone still measured but firmer now. Mr. Kessler, were you aware that your father's office contacted a university IT employee regarding the security footage from that night? Brayden hesitated, glancing sideways at his father before answering. Not at first, he said slowly. He told me afterward. Said it would take care of things. I didn't ask a lot of questions. I figured it was just how things worked. The professor made a note, her expression unreadable, but her pen moving with visible weight behind each word. That's precisely the problem, isn't it? She said quietly, more to the room than to Brayden directly. When somebody grows up believing consequences are optional, they stop asking the questions that might have stopped them sooner. Nobody in the room offered a response to that. Nobody needed to. The hearing continued for another 20 minutes, methodical and thorough, working through the remaining evidence, the access logs, Russell Dahl's statement, the corroborating witness accounts from students who'd finally found the courage to speak once the truth had already broken through. Hannah, who'd been waiting outside the room the entire time at Renee's quiet suggestion, was called in to give a brief statement about the stairwell incident days earlier, describing the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed from Brayden and his friends throughout the week. 2 other students, freshmen, who'd been too afraid to speak up earlier in the semester, submitted written statements describing similar incidents from the previous year. patterns that had never been formally addressed because nobody had ever felt safe enough to report them. By the time Dean Foster called for a short recess to allow the panel to deliberate, the entire shape of the room had changed. Gordon Kessler sat silently beside his son, the confident posture of the morning completely gone, replaced by something heavier. Something closer to the weight of consequences, finally catching up to years of quiet influence. There's a particular moment that comes for people who've spent their whole lives assuming influence would always be enough to smooth over any problem. It rarely announces itself in advance. It simply arrives quietly in a room like this one, when enough small pieces of truth finally stack up higher than the confidence built to hide from them. Gordon Kessler had spent decades building that kind of confidence. 2 decades of donations, favors, quiet phone calls, and reputation carefully managed. He'd learned somewhere along the way that most problems could be made to disappear if you simply applied enough pressure in the right direction. What he'd never learned, not until this morning, was that some problems don't disappear. They wait. They gather themselves quietly in the hands of people willing to keep pushing, long after most would have given up. People like a retired security guard with 22 years of patient instinct, a roommate finally brave enough to hit send on an email past midnight, and a young woman who refused to let one bad week convince her the truth wasn't worth waiting for. During the recess, Jo stepped out into the hallway and found her grandfather waiting for her. She hugged him without saying anything for a long moment. "I almost gave up last night," she admitted quietly, her face against his shoulder. "I know," Walter said, holding her steady. "But you didn't. That's the part that matters." "I didn't do this alone," Jo said, pulling back slightly. "Chloe, Ed, Renee, even Owen. So many people helped." Walter smiled. "That's how it usually works, kiddo. Nobody carries the truth all the way to the light by themselves. It takes people willing to hand it forward one piece at a time until it finally reaches somebody who can do something with it." The panel reconvened 40 minutes later. Dean Foster read the decision aloud, his voice formal but carrying a clear undertone of relief that the truth had finally been established beyond reasonable doubt. Based on the evidence presented, he said this panel finds that Mr. Kessler initiated the physical altercation at the welcome bash without provocation, and that Miss Calloway's response constituted reasonable defensive action on behalf of another student. The interim suspension against Miss Calloway is hereby lifted effective immediately with full reinstatement of her academic standing. A quiet exhale moved through the room, relief settling over Jo's shoulders like something physical finally set down after being carried too long. Foster continued. "Regarding Mr. Kessler, given the severity of tonight's findings, along with corroborating evidence of a pattern of similar behavior in previous semesters, this panel recommends immediate suspension from the university for the remainder of the academic year, along with permanent removal from his position as team captain, pending further review by the athletics department." Brayden sat motionless, staring at the table, offering no protest this time. Regarding the interference with security footage, Foster added, "This matter will be referred to University Legal Counsel for further investigation along with the appropriate authorities given the serious nature of the allegations involving misuse of influence and obstruction." Gordon Kessler's face had gone entirely gray by the time the hearing concluded. News of what happened in that conference room spread across campus by dinner time, though this time, for once, the true version of events outpaced every distorted rumor that had circulated the week before. 2 days later, at a public city council meeting that drew far more attendance than usual, Gordon Kessler stood before a room full of constituents and delivered a public apology. His voice noticeably smaller than the confident tone most people in that town had grown used to hearing from him. The council chamber, usually half empty for routine meetings about zoning permits and road maintenance budgets, was packed that evening, word having spread quickly through a town where everybody eventually heard everything. Reporters from the local papers sat in the front row, along with several parents of students who'd attended Ashcombe State over the years, some of them nodding grimly, having quietly suspected for a long time that something like this had been building. He acknowledged misusing his position to interfere with a university investigation. He acknowledged, though clearly with great difficulty, that his son's behavior had gone unaddressed for far too long, in part because of exactly the kind of influence he'd just been forced to admit misusing. His voice cracked once briefly when he mentioned Brayden by name, a small human moment that reminded the room, even those who felt little sympathy for him, after everything that had come out, that behind the title and the influence, he was still a father watching consequences arrive for a son he'd perhaps failed to guide as carefully as he should have. He announced his resignation from the council effective at the end of the month. It wasn't a perfect ending. Some in the town would say it came too late after too much damage had already settled quietly into too many lives over too many years. A few former students grown now reached out to the local paper in the days that followed, describing their own quiet run-ins with Brayden or his friends over the years. Incidents that had never been reported, never addressed, simply absorbed and carried forward, the way so many young people learn to carry things they were never taught how to properly put down. But it was for the first time in a long while, an honest one. The following Friday, Ashcombe State held a small ceremony in the student union organized quietly by Dean Foster and Coach Renee Coulter, meant to formally close the chapter that had consumed the campus for the better part of 2 weeks. The student union lobby had been decorated. Simply nothing elaborate, just a few chairs arranged in loose rows and a small table near the honor board, holding a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of cookies somebody's mother had insisted on bringing. It wasn't the kind of grand ceremony that made headlines. It was the kind that mattered more because of how ordinary and genuine it felt, a small community quietly acknowledging something important, without needing to make a spectacle of it. A handful of faculty members stopped in on their lunch break, and a few students who'd never met Joe personally came anyway, having heard enough about what happened over the past 2 weeks to want to be present for whatever this small gathering turned out to be. There was something quietly moving about that strangers showing up simply because a story about decency deserved witnesses too, not just the injustice that came before it. Joe stood near the front of a modest crowd, Chloe beside her. Owen and his parents a few rows back, Ed and Renee standing near the entrance the way they always seemed to, watching quietly, rather than seeking attention for the part they'd played. Hannah stood a little further back, having become something close to a friend over the past 2 weeks. The kind of quiet friendship built not on shared classes or dorm assignments, but on having stood on the same side of something difficult. Word had spread that Joe's grandfather was in attendance too, and a few students who recognized his name from Renee's self-defense classes approached him before the ceremony began, asking careful, respectful questions about his training background. Walter answered with the same humble patience he'd shown his granddaughter for 6 years. One young man, a sophomore, Joe barely recognized, thanked Walter for something he said years ago at a seminar his own father had attended, a small ripple of influence Walter hadn't realized was still moving through the world long after he'd stopped teaching those classes. Dean Foster spoke briefly about the importance of courage. Real courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but shows up quietly again and again until the truth finally has enough support to stand on its own. He mentioned, without naming names unnecessarily, the several people whose quiet persistence had made this outcome possible. A security guard who trusted his instincts, a roommate who found her voice when it mattered most, a coach who believed in a student before she had proof to justify that belief, and a young woman who simply refused to become someone she wasn't, no matter how much pressure came her way. Then he turned to Joe. "We'd like to do something small," he said, gesturing toward a wooden honor board mounted near the entrance of the student union, a place where the university traditionally recognized students who'd shown exceptional character. Joe stepped forward, and Renee handed her a small, delicate frame. Inside it sat the 2 broken pieces of blue elastic carefully mended by a jeweler in town, that Renee had quietly arranged earlier that week, restored as closely as possible to what it had once been, a small seam of silver thread, holding it together where it had broken. Joe held it a long moment, her throat tight. The frame was simple dark wood with a plain glass front. Nothing fancy, but it caught the afternoon light coming through the student union windows in a way that made the small seam of silver thread almost glow. She thought about the parking lot on move-in day, the sound of Brayden's laughter, the humiliation she'd swallowed quietly while kneeling to gather up the broken pieces. She thought about every day since, every small cruelty absorbed every quiet phone call to her grandfather. Every moment she'd chosen patience over anger, because that's what she'd been taught mattered most. She thought about her grandmother, gone 2 winters now, who'd handed her this small, ordinary piece of elastic and told her it would help her remember who loved her. It had done far more than that. It had become somehow a measure of everything Jo carried inside her, that nobody at this school had bothered to notice until it mattered too much to ignore any longer. Her grandmother's voice echoed somewhere in the back of her mind, warm and steady, even now. The people who love you don't leave when they're gone, honey. They just change shape. She hung the small frame on the honor board herself, her hands steady, her grandfather watching from the crowd with an expression Jo would remember for the rest of her life. Owen stepped forward afterward, quiet as always, and shook Jo's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not walking past." Jo smiled, the first full, easy smile anybody on that campus had seen from her in 2 weeks. "That's not really something you should have to thank someone for," she said gently. "It should just be what people do," maybe Owen said. "But it isn't always. So thank you anyway." Later that evening, back in her dorm room, Jo called her grandfather one last time. Well, she said some of it worked out. Walter chuckled on the other end of the line. "Told you the truth was still working?" There was a long, comfortable silence between them, the kind 2 people share when they don't need words to feel close to each other. "I think Grandma would have liked how this turned out," Jo finally said. "I think she'd have liked how you turned out," Walter said. "Long before any of this happened." Jo smiled, looking over at the small frame she'd set on her desk before heading to the ceremony. A photograph of it she'd taken on her phone, the mended blue hair tie catching the evening light. Somewhere out there in dorm rooms and dining halls across a campus that had spent 2 weeks learning a hard, necessary lesson, people were starting to understand something that mattered far beyond one freshman girl and one arrogant football captain. It showed up in small ways over the following weeks. Owen started sitting with a group of friends at lunch instead of eating alone. Several of them students who'd quietly admired the way he'd stood up and told the truth, even when it would have been easier not to. Chloe found herself speaking up more often in small, ordinary moments, correcting a professor's mistaken grading, defending a classmate from an unkind joke in the dorm, small acts of courage that build one on top of the other into a different kind of person entirely. Dean Foster kept a small note on his desk after that semester, tucked under the edge of his desk calendar, where only he ever saw it, 3 words in his own handwriting that he'd copied down from something Walter Calloway said during the recess that day. Character, not confidence. It reminded him, on the harder days, what exactly he was supposed to be protecting, when a powerful voice showed up demanding a shortcut. Hannah started a peer support group later that semester. Informal at first, just a handful of students who'd experienced something similar meeting once a week to talk it through, a small effort that eventually grew into something the university formally recognized the following year. Even Brayden, in the quiet aftermath of his suspension, seemed to carry something different with him. Renee ran into him once, months later, working part-time at a hardware store 2 towns over while he sorted out what came next. He'd nodded to her, quiet and a little embarrassed, and told her unprompted that he thought about that day at the fountain more than he expected to. Renee didn't know what would ultimately become of him. Nobody ever really does with people like that. But she left the conversation with the sense that something in him had shifted, even if only slightly, even if the road ahead of him remained uncertain. Kindness isn't weakness. Silence isn't safety. And the quietest person in the room is sometimes carrying more strength, more history, and more heart than anybody around them ever bothered to notice. That's a lesson worth remembering. Whether you're 18 years old walking into your first semester of college or 80 years old, watching the world change around you from a porch swing that still creaks in the right kind of way. It's a lesson worth passing down too, the way Walter passed it down to Jo. The way Jo's own quiet example passed it down to a roommate, a fellow freshman, and a whole community that had spent 2 weeks relearning what courage actually looks like when it finally shows up. Because in the end, this was never really a story about a hair tie or a wrist lock or a hearing room full of nervous adults trying to sort out the truth. It was never really about Brayden Kessler either, not in the way it might have first appeared. Stories like this one are rarely about the person who does the pushing. They're about everyone standing around him who eventually decides one at a time to do something instead of nothing. It was a story about what happens when ordinary people, a security guard, a coach, a roommate, a grandfather, a quiet freshman with more discipline than anyone gave her credit for, decide one small choice at a time to stand up instead of standing by. That night, they didn't just learn who was strongest. They learned that decency needs defenders too, and that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to go first.